Welcome back to Let's Combinate Drugs and Devices. We are graced and honored once again by a dear friend, Susan Neadle. Susan Neadle is the author of the Combination Product Handbook. I think this is maybe your fourth time, maybe fifth. I don't know.
Maybe. I don't know. I lost count.
Welcome back. Yeah, welcome back, Susan. We're going to be talking about a topic that is evergreen, it seems, a topic that will never go away. It's crazy that in 2025, we're still talking about it because it feels like such a 2012 conversation, and that is lexicon terminology as far as drug device combination products. You've been like trying to attack this problem from a bunch of different vectors. So maybe level set us on what is the actual problem at a high level, and how you've been trying to do that.
Sure. So back in 2014, I'll say, God, it's been 11 years. So about 11 years ago, when I was very active in the combination product space and industry, and it took hold on me and I never just left it, it was my first introduction of moving from the device world into the farm world. And as I was making that move, I found myself having conversations with people about simple things like packaging. And it occurring to me well into the conversation that we were having two different conversations because people were interpreting the same exact words with different meanings. And at that point, I coined the phrase, the dictionary and thesaurus of combination products. I like your shorter term, which is the lexicon, but that's what I've called it for years now. It's the dictionary and thesaurus. And initially, actually, I was working with Manfred Mader, and we had approached ASTM to try to put together a standard on creating a terminology standard for combination products. And right there, I said the word combination product. So there was a terminology issue right from the get-go, because in some jurisdictions, a given product like a pre-filled syringe is a combination product. In other jurisdictions, that exact same product with no changes to it whatsoever is considered a drug only. Right. And so you start getting into what's a container closure versus a medical device, or maybe it's both, or what is it? So we started to try to build a standard on definitions. And we did get health authorities from around the world engaged in the project. And we had numerous companies from globally also interacting on the program. And we actually got a draft document together, but in the end, I think we used the analogy in an earlier conversation just between you and I, that it was like, okay, we're trying to get the spark going, let's puff on it and get the flame going so that we have something robust that industry can use. Unfortunately, the flame tuckered out, and there's a lot of politics that came in when we started to try to create a standard glossary, because some companies are very tied to whatever construct they've developed. And you also really do have to consider that different regulatory frameworks around the world have different interpretations, and even what they charge for products is going to be aligned to what is the lead center associated with that product, or what is the primary mode of action for that product. So those are all considerations that get into the game on this. That said, in the first edition of the Combination Products Handbook, in Chapter 5, there's actually several terms that I highlighted to go through. Hey, wait, here's your dictionary and thesaurus. Here's some terms that people get caught up on. It's just that since the time that I even published that, I still have conversations with people, and it's, here's another word. So I just keep adding into my little dictionary and thesaurus. And when we have the second edition of the Combination Products Handbook, it will have an update to it.
Well, it's kind of like Blue's Clues, right? As soon as you start solving a problem, like you start finding little crumbs here and there of like, okay, we solved we addressed most of it before, but we didn't get this one. And so it ends up being like a catch-all exercise every time you're going through an update. Do you feel like the ASTM ship has sailed, or is there like still an opportunity to, move that forward?
It pretty much stalled. We did about 3 or 4 rounds of votes on it, and it always got caught up on the term platform. So,
And I mean, that's one that is, It's not even just in regulation caught up, it's also in law caught up, right? So that's
It's
like a
caught up
pretty,
in law.
that's got a
It's
lot,
caught up.
it's got a lot of
Yes.
baggage.
There's a lot of baggage with it. And what we had ended up doing, because we had to get the regulators aligned, not just industry, but also regulators, is when we started playing around to come up with a very streamlined, pointed definition for it. It was a lot easier to write the pointed definition than it was to discuss it. So for that particular standard, we put the short definition, and we decided that we would have an annex or an addendum to the standard that would include a discussion around all the debates that would happen whenever we would start talking about platform devices and
And so it'd be like
platforms,
short,
period.
it would be like short and then see appendix for further discussion on this.
Exactly.
Like this one we're addressing, but it's a nebulous term and it can mean a bunch of things depending on context.
Yes. And in the middle of us writing it, the FDA had come out with their technology or platform regulation or guidance. It was a specific guidance on platforms, and it states in it outright, it does not apply to devices, period.
Bang.
Bullet number 6, note number 6 in that guidance. I know it by heart.
Yeah.
But it specifically tells you that if you're trying to use a device as a quote unquote platform, treat that under bridging, right? And we've got bridging guidance to help you address how to bridge the change in devices. And industry did not welcome that comment with open arms. So industry, I think, still tends to use the terminology we're platforming, or we're using a platform device. But from a health authority perspective, you have to, and even an industry perspective, take out whether it's industry or health authority, from a science and a risk-based perspective, which is what you really have to focus on when it comes to any of these terms and definitions. What it comes down to is, if I have the exact same device and I'm using it on different drugs, the first thing that I have to do is that risk analysis to figure out what might be new, unique, or different about the way this drug or its excipients is going to interact with that device. And based on that, what are now the new potential risks, and what are the new control strategies that I need to develop and apply to that particular combination product? And so that really was the hat that we started to wear working on these standards, is you've got to think from a science and risk-based perspective. If I'm looking at that platform device, what exactly is changing as I go from the device for one drug to another drug to another drug? Am I quote unquote only changing the IFU, or am I changing the spring force? Well, what if now I'm changing the length of the spring? What if I'm changing the material that's in the needle gate, the rigid needle shield? I'm making it up, right? But there's a whole continuum of what is considered, it's a platform, versus at what point do I say, sorry, that's now a different device. You can no longer say it's the same. And from a health authority perspective, when we were having the deep conversations about this, they said, look, if it's the exact same device, so that I could look at a device master file and it would tell me all the exact same things, great. And then I'll focus on what are the risk-based differences relative to that drug. But you're trying to say it's a platform when actually you're changing multiple things about the device to accommodate whatever this new application is. Therefore, we can't just look at that device master file. We have to be able to look at that whole device and whatever data you've got to figure out what about that, its components, its subassemblies, whatever, might interact differently with your specific drug. So if you keep your focus on what are the science and risk-based justifications for why it's appropriate to leverage pre-existing data for a product, then you could call that platforming that data. But to say that the whole device is a platform is where the rub really hits the grinder for many of the health authorities. And that's where industry is, no, but we want it to be our definition, which is we want that wide band of what we interpret as platform. So I think that really is where everything fell apart, because we could not get alignment on what people wanted to perceive or wanted to treat as a platform in terms of the definitions. We probably could have issued it if we took that term out, but it seemed so important to the standard that we were like, no, let's just stop right now.
On platforms, like I remember when I used to work in generics, we differentiated where if we were going to have like a few different configurations, and we said, here's a configuration, it has a slew of drugs in it. Here's a configuration, it has a slew of drugs in it. Here's a configuration, it has a slew of drugs in it. And we're going to matrix out all of our testing. And, you know, we obviously did like type C meetings and stuff like that to get
Make a
buy-in and
design
stuff.
space.
Yeah, design. Yeah, that's a good, to use the ICH-Q8 terminology. I mean, let's not get into that, but yeah, the same idea of a DOE, like how do I make sure all the corners are covered? And we were able to do that. I think a lot of times what ends up happening is like companies will have a unique situation where they want to modify a component on a existing platform and they still want to call it a platform. And so that's kind of the situation that you're talking about. Did you try to get it through without platform, or you thought it was a futile exercise without it?
No, we didn't do it without platform because that was it was a lightning rod for conversation and the standard. So at that point we stopped.
I guess where I was going is more, if that's the one that's going to hold everything up, then can't you like get it through and then put platform in V2?
There was a lot of work that went into the first version, and then the second iteration of it. It went through, I think, 7 or 8 versions of the standard.
And to be honest, like
it was just tough.
It's one of the hardest things to do, to try and coordinate like this kind of activity, because dealing with everybody's comments, and you're talking about like 30, 40 people, right? Because
it was actually fun doing it internationally. It was fun getting everybody's perspective and getting people to align. Like even I'm picking on the health authorities a little bit because it was really constructive conversations where they literally look at it and they say, we do not under any circumstances interpret it the same way as you do in the United States. And just pick on that. Okay, but how can we align? And we could align to whether you consider it a combination product or a combined use product. You've got different types of products that you're bringing together that are intended to be used together in order to achieve your intended therapeutic effect or intended use for the product. Okay, so what are the risks that go with that? If you can focus on those scientific and risk-based considerations and how you're going to address them, we're totally aligned. And so it didn't matter what the different regulatory constructs were in the jurisdictions, because we could align to what do we need to think about when we're thinking about the interactions and the interrelationships between the constituent parts. But actually, now that I think about it, the word combined use also became a lightning rod, because then people were objecting to saying, don't call it combined use. That's too broad. It covers too many things. And it's okay. You know what? At this point in time, I have so many other things that I want to address that I took that off the priority list.
You know, to be honest, I mean, the hardest problems to solve take a lot of time, right? And a lot of effort. So good on you for the attempt. And I think like my hope is that we do have a standard eventually that we can deal that deals with this problem kind of once and for all, because it's one thing to say like my definition is this, your definition is that, but like arguing it over something that's on a piece of paper is a lot more constructive than like because what ends up happening in combination products uniquely outside of drug and device is people use their lived experience to try and define expectations and requirements more so than if you were just in device. And that's the actual impact. But backpedaling, I remembered something. Now, as far as like the combined use definition, in the US, we have combination products. In the EU, it's not actually called combination products. So can you talk about like the construct differences?
So it's that part of it, I think, is the most straightforward. In the United States, a combination product is single entity, right, where I've got physically or chemically mixed products into a single unit. I've got co-packaged products where I've got the different constituent parts that by themselves, they're still the constituent parts, but they're packaged together in a container. And then you've got the cross-label products. Okay, in Europe, they do use the term combination product, but they never put a formal legal definition of it into their regulation. The regulation refers to the term, but does not to a legal definition. Now, that said, If I have a single integral combination product in Europe where that product is not reusable, then that drug device combination is one that they would say, yep, that's a combination product. Like they'll treat it
But so
that
that's
way
where
under Article 117. The co-packs that we treat as a combination product in the United States, those are non-integral in Europe, and they don't treat them as combination product. They need separate approvals on the device and the drug constituent parts.
well, so maybe I was like sharpen your number two pencil, but it's called like DDC, right? Drug device combination,
Drugs
not product.
combinations.
Because we were talking
Correct.
before we started recording about like what is the definition of product, and like in ISO 13485, product is it's not this isn't exactly it. It's like the output of a process, and so you can have an ISO site, you can have an ISO certified site where what they're certified for is their sterilization services, which would be under the ISO standard of product because it's an output of a process. And so, whereas DP is that's not the same kind of lens.
Yeah, the interpretation of the word product is different in the different jurisdictions. Although when it comes to the device, it's the product that we think of, the actual device. It's the packaging and labeling. It's the manufacturing processes used to create that device. And then it's anything, even your shipping and just all that whole thing is your product. Versus in the drug world, typically you'll think about it's my drug with its excipients in the final, is it a solution?
Finished.
Is it a tablet? What is that? What's the configuration of that final dose that I'm going to be delivering to somebody? And the process is not necessarily what somebody talks about. Like you need the process to be under control so that the CQAs of your product are going to be what you've committed them to be. In the device world, there's the CTQs of the product, the critical material attributes, there's the essential outputs, there's your critical process parameters in the manufacturing process. All of those are part of the product, right? And your labeling and packaging, that's part of the product. And so right away, even before I've gone into the combination product space, that's a difference between device world and drug world.
I wanted you to maybe go through like the construct differences in terms of how drugs and devices are set up, because on the device side, we have standards and regulations by and large. Those are our compass for the most part. Guidance is from regulatory agencies, but like, yeah, I mean, I guess we do have harmonized guidelines, but they don't carry as much weight as like ICH on the drug side. There's also regulations on the drug side. So could you maybe talk about like some of the challenges of aligning terminology that come from just the way the drug and device is set up?
So when you look at both the drug world and the device world, there is dependence on regulations. In the United States, we use 21 CFR 210-211. In the device world, we use 21 CFR 820, right? Or ISO 13485 is a standard that's used under EU MDR, right? The European Medical Device Regulations. There's the Medicinal Product Directive, which is a regulation. And underneath that, it refers to different standards or guidelines, right? So where things get interesting is that under the device regulatory construct or framework, the things that are referenced, like design and development controls, ISO 14971, and actually I'll even put aside ISO 14971 for a second, but design and development controls, risk management, human factors, those are things that are explicitly stated in the regulations, okay? Risk management, I put it to the side for a moment earlier because in the original quality system regulation, which is going away come February 2026, in the original, it talked about risk management, but a lot of the references to it were in the preamble to the regulations versus now under the QMSR, which is using ISO 13485 by reference, there's explicit references to risk management and the use of ISO 14971 as a standard that can satisfy conformity or demonstrating conformity to the regulations. On the drug side, when I flip it over, you've got in the US, we talk about 21 CFR 210-211, but many people talk about ICH Q8R2, which is quality by design, ICHQ-9R1, which is quality risk management, and ICHQ-10, which is my pharmaceutical quality systems. Those are guidelines. They're like best practices, okay, that one would hope that you're applying as you're developing your product, but those are not the same as a regulation. A regulation is something that you can get written up because you didn't follow that regulation. Well, it turns out, and I'm just going to pick on one for CAPA, corrective and preventive action. 21 CFR 210-211 does not even talk about CAPA. It's not in it. Right. ICHQ-10 does talk about it. And therefore, many pharmaceutical companies, when they hear, oh, there's an expectation that you do CAPA as part of the device called out provisions for medical devices for combination products, they go, we're already doing CAPA, so we don't have to change anything because we know that we do it under Q10. But that's where the rubber meets the road, because CAPA in the device interpretation is, in fact, a specific part of the regulations, and it has very explicit mandates for what you're expected to do with it versus Q10, which is a guideline. So whereas, and I think when you were interviewing Jeff Genzer, you guys talked about this, where CAPA on the drug side is typically treated like what one might call a CAPA action.
CAPA record, the device, or CAPA action.
Yeah, it's like, okay, yep, I have a problem. I'm going to investigate and fix it. And hopefully you do effectiveness checks, but we don't necessarily, it's not a mandate for our process, right? In the device world, 100% of every single CAPA is supposed to have an effectiveness check. And not only that, but the things that I call CAPA are usually a magnitude much bigger. They're systemic issues. They're very significant, serious issues that have built up, or that you know that there's such a serious impact from it that, yes, I'm opening a CAPA. I've got repeated issues. I have to do something about it. So there's another dictionary and thesaurus thing where it is interpreted differently in the two worlds, but they use the exact same terminology. So people hear it and they go, oh, we're good. The only thing that's different terminology here is design controls. So now it's design and development controls. So that's the thing we're going to focus on. I can't tell you how many companies I now work with that have gotten the nasty surprise, unfortunately, in the middle of an inspection from a health authority where they go, oh, no, it's not interpreted the same way. Correct, it's not. And that's the thing that, unfortunately, for so many years, this dictionary and thesaurus still is an issue because that understanding that even though they're using the same terminology, purchasing controls, same issue, right? They're using the same terminology, but the explicit regulatory requirements that you need to follow in order to implement them in a way that's considered compliant is different in the two worlds.
What, let's dive into what are those terms that end up becoming lightning rods, to use your wording in discussions? Like, we covered CAPA, we talked about product, combined use and combination product. There are others like process validation.
Oh, process validation. Let's see. There's little ones like component. The word component is defined differently in the drug world than it is in the device world. So right away, if you're working with a third-party supplier and you think you're talking about components, you have a problem. In the drug world, a component is something that is not necessarily in the final drug product. It might be something that you're using to help in processing the product, but you're going to rinse it out, or it's just not going to be there in the final drug product. In the device world, if I talk about the word component, we're talking about things that are intended to be included as part of the finished and packaged and labeled device. So opposite expectations of the word component. And depending on who your supplier is, they might consider them to be packaging components. Okay. And they treat it as a container closure. So it follows the container closure expectations under the regulations, but it doesn't necessarily meet any of the other obligations as a device constituent part. And so it gets very comical, because then as a combination product manufacturer, both definitions or interpretations of the word component apply, even though you now have a combination product. And that component supplier or device supplier who is maybe manufacturing the product design, right? They're manufacturing the whole device, but they're going to provide you with the components like the syringe barrels. They'll send you those separately from the syringe plungers. Why? Because that way it's not an assembled device and they're still a component supplier. So officially, if you look at the definition of the term manufacturer, they are considered combination product manufacturers because the fact that they are designing the device, those components to work together so that you have an effective device, that makes them a combination product manufacturer. That's under the definition.
Have you seen,
it includes design.
in terms of actual recourse though, have you seen component suppliers audited, inspected? Sorry, have you seen component suppliers inspected as combination product manufacturers?
Yes, absolutely. And it depends on who's doing the inspection. Unfortunately, even though the FDA issued their combination products compliance program back in 2020, many times if your inspector hails from CDER, they tend to not pay quite as close attention to the device called out provisions and the device interpretations of things. If they're a CDRH investigator that comes into your facility, that's usually where many people realize the repercussions of, oh no, our dictionary in Thesaurus is broken. And I have seen the FDA go into a supplier and sometimes even to a supplier's supplier when it was considered a critical constituent part by the combination product sponsor, a component by the packaging supplier or CMO. And in the end, it's something that was problematic in the performance of the product in the marketplace. And the FDA was like, we're leaving no stone unturned, and we are going to come in. And you have to be careful because even in the regulation, it says, while they don't typically hold the component supplier to the obligations of the CGMPs, it doesn't mean that they are necessarily fully exempt. Like they have the right to impose those expectations if they think it's appropriate based on the services a given supplier is providing or the products it's providing.
And they clarified that in the QMSR, right?
Yes, they did. And they clarified it in the QMSR, also in the preamble to Part 4, which if people took the time to look, they specifically call out and let people know that don't think that just because you're a component supplier, you're off the hook. Because if you're actually assembling those components with the drug in any way, you are a combination product manufacturer and you are going to be held liable to Part 4, the CGMPs for combination products, not just for the constituent part that's their quote unquote comfort zone. Yeah. So that whole lexicon and dictionary and thesaurus, you can see there's so many different threads that it hits you on or attracts the lightning on across your process. It's incredible.
If you had a top 3, what would be your top 3 definitions to just like one and done, have an aligned term?
Component is my first and foremost definition. That with packaging, because it really does. Those two together, I put them together as one, because a device manufacturer says that syringe is a device. And the drug supplier says, no, that's my packaging. It's my primary package. It's a component. And before you've ever even started down the path of a combination product, you already have a disconnect. And that's the easy part. The term manufacturer, it would be great if there could be alignment to that term.
Well, like on that one specifically, like the component versus device, things like primary packaging are typically treated with the utmost care, right? It's not like, because it's going to be flowing into like sterile fill finish activity, you don't want anything that's potentially contaminated or of concern to be entering into that controlled of an environment. So it's scrutinized quite heavily. Like basically it's typically tier 1 type supplier, if that's the case.
Not all companies treat it quite the same way. And it depends on whether or not, again, remember, it depends on who's working with the product. If I have several experts that I brought in from a device company, they're looking at that quote unquote primary package. And they're saying, yes, this thing's very critical and we are going to classify it at the top of the criticality because we consider it to be the device constituent part. At a drug company, some people will consider that to be a secondary or tertiary package. So think about a case where I have a cassette that has the drug and the like a diluent packaged together in the cassette. Is that cassette going to be a container closure? Is it a component? Is it the device? Well, it depends.
So I was maybe jumping into the syringe, like the empty syringe as the example, because I feel like for that one,
particulate and things like
right,
that.
that is primary packaging, like that, a
Yes.
vial, a plunger, like
Yes.
those kinds of things are like threat level midnight, right? Those are super
Yes.
critical. That can cause a lot of issues. I think you're right. When it becomes like maybe a different configuration or not so cut and dry, the component versus device ends up becoming maybe a meaningful differentiator.
And it is. If I have especially if I have a single entity combination product or single integral, if I have co-packs, then okay, you can have some different conversations. But if I have a single entity combination product where each of those quote unquote components is intended to be assembled. So I have my pre-filled syringe that's being assembled into the auto injector shell. Well, they all have to work together. So are those really components or is it the constituent part? If I'm looking at that whole auto injector that's pre-filled, I'm going to say that that's a device constituent. Okay. Oh, the pre-filled syringe inside of it, that's also a device constituent, right? So you can already feel where there's disconnects because within some companies, they'll say, but that's not the final user interface. The final user interface is XYZ. Okay, there's confusion. No matter what, it turns into, you got a dictionary thesaurus issue because you can have people having conversations with each other and they think they're saying the exact same thing, but they have their own interpretations of what they're communicating.
Yeah. And because there is no unifying definition, they're both right or both wrong, and it doesn't matter.
They're both right, but the problem is that for the combination product, one of them or both of them might be wrong. You're right.
Where do people find you, Susan?
They can find me either through LinkedIn. Feel free to connect with me either through my consulting webpage, Combination Products Consulting Services, or they can just reach out to me personally, Susan Neadle on LinkedIn, or through my webpage, www.combinationproductconsulting.com.